Welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see so many people here who share an interest in the history of the St. Croix River Valley, especially those stories centered here in St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin. My name is Elena Feedy, Operations Manager of the St. Croix Watershed Research Station, which is a division of the Science Museum of Minnesota, which I hope you've all heard of once or twice. I'm also, as part of my job, the Program Director of the Artists at Pine Needles Residency Program. I'm not a very good public speaker, so bear with me. With the mission of enhancing scientific understanding through art, the Pine Needles program has welcomed writers and poets, painters and photographers, ironsmiths, musicians, and many others, all committed to exploring the interconnectedness of two different ways of understanding our world, science and art. Haley Prochnow marks our 80th artist since 2002 and carries that mission forward with remarkable depth and intention. Haley holds a Bachelor of Arts from Hamline University and a Master's of Arts from the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. Her writings have been widely published and her paintings and textile works have appeared in exhibitions across the region. Her ongoing project, called Northern Exposure, is an online monthly column delving into the history of the St. Croix River Valley. We are very proud to now count Haley Prochnow as an alumni of the Artists at Pine Needles program. As a cultural and historical writer, Haley explores the local culture, social history, and environmental relationships within the river valley. Her work amplifies stories that have too often been overlooked, especially those of women and underrepresented communities. Her current project, which we're all here to see, focuses on early 20th century conservationist Florence Baker Riegel, whose studies in marine biology shaped lifelong commitments to science, community health, and the preservation of this valley. Florence's efforts contributed to early momentum behind the Wild and Scenic Rivers movement and helped lay the groundwork for what we now know as the Croix Meadow Wildlife Area. It is an honor to introduce her today, so please join me in welcoming Haley Prochnow to the stage.
Trip going out of the tiny door, so we've already made lots of progress. Let me just get set up really quick for you. Awesome. All right, well, I hope you're ready to dive into what I have been working on through the Pine Needles Artist Residency, like Elena said, but really this work started in 2024 when I first became introduced to Florence's wonderful descendants who have helped so much in this story and this research. So thank you, all of you, for coming out of your homes tonight to join me to hear this story. Tonight I will be sharing the story of who I consider to be one of my local heroes, Florence Baker and later Riegel. So this story starts where all wonderful stories start, in a waiting room. Many of you probably recognize this waiting room. It is the clinic waiting room at St. Croix Health, and you may or may not have noticed this wall dedicated to Dr. Fred Riegel and Dr. Jake Riegel, the two credited with starting the hospital here in St. Croix Falls. There's also an original painting of the original hospital, aka the Bodfish House, which I'll talk about a little later in my presentation. If you look all the way to your right, there is a third photo, and it is of Jake, Dr. Jake, and his wife, Florence, who I'm talking about tonight. And Florence's story is really not dissimilar to other women of her time. Her story was always one that kind of came in second to the really successful men in her life. And so I'm excited to get to tell you what I've learned about her over these past few months. And even for those of you who may have knew her, I hope I can share a little more depth into what she was like. And so I've split up my presentation tonight into, I guess, what I would call chapters. It's really hard to encompass somebody's entire life in like a 45-minute period. So we're gonna go all the way from girlhood, and we'll travel to these different places of significance in her life. So of course, we'll start with her early life. And before I get into Florence specifically, I think it's important for you all to know who her father was. So Florence's father was Major Joseph S. Baker, and he is widely known as a Civil War hero. He was in the Union Secret Service, and he was part of the elite cavalry that apprehended John Wilkes Booth after Lincoln's assassination. Before the Civil War, he studied forestry at UW-Madison and Oberlin College, and then after the war, he was a land agent in Lansing, Michigan. Around 1874, he was appointed by the U.S. Attorney General to manage the St. Croix Falls land office here. So you'll know that as the Historical Society's current headquarters, the Baker Land and Title Company building on Main Street. I'm moving the mic because I'm getting feedback. I don't know if you can hear that. Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, so by all, with all intents and purposes, he was a hero to everybody in his life, including Florence. And so, of course, he is a big man with a big personality, a big history, and he also has a very large family. So in the Baker family, there were 10 children in total. I am not going to go through all of their history. That would probably take another hour of my time, but what I think is important to call out is that they were all very, very successful in their areas of study and then their fields of work. And the most famous of all the Baker children was Ray Stannard Baker. He was a very famous progressive journalist of the early 20th century. He later won a Pulitzer Prize for his biography of Woodrow Wilson. And subsequently, you're going to hear a lot about him tonight as he was Florence's favorite brother. The other brothers all were successful in their own right. Her brother Charles was a successful entomologist. Other brothers took on careers in forestry and were the deans of colleges. She had a brother who went to MIT. He later became an important chemical engineer, and so on and so forth. You will notice that she has one sister, and so while Florence and her sister Winifred were really just as educated as all of their brothers, their stories are just like harder to come by, and hence why I'm talking to you tonight. So one thing that I do want to point out about all of the children is that in their lives and in their careers, they carried through this love of nature and the natural environment in everything that they do. Their father sort of set the stage for that with his work through forestry and land management. So now we get to the good stuff. I do want to say that 99% of the photos that I'm going to show you tonight and the video that was playing when you walked in, these are all family photos that have been archived with love by the Riegel descendants, and so I've been so lucky to be a steward of them to help tell this story tonight. So Florence was born on August 29th, 1892, and by all accounts, she was not a wilting flower. In a family of 8 boys, she had an incredible sense of adventure, a wonderful imagination. She could ride horse, she could fish, swim, roughhouse. She kept up with her brothers very well. And as you can see in this photo, they both kind of exemplify that kind of defiance. And in one of the photos, she's actually riding her father's horse named Old Dan. But there's, people contain multitudes. There's another side to Florence as well. She was from a wealthy family, and she very much adhered to expectations of a young woman of the time. So she was incredibly active in social organizations in St. Croix Falls. She was active in Christian endeavors. She taught Sunday school. She sang in the choir. And she was incredibly active in the local chapter of the YWCA. One of her lesser known clubs is something that I had never heard of before until I started this research. So Florence was a member of what I know now as the Little Mothers Club. And the Little Mothers Club first appeared in the Sunday edition of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune in 1900. It was a club that appeared in the children's section. It was to appeal to young girls. Each branch of this club was named after a flower. So, for example, the St. Paul branch was known as Pansy Circle, and the St. Croix Falls branch was called the American Beauty Rose Circle. So how this would work is girls would receive badges, kind of a lot like Girl Scouts, for learning cooking, sewing, cleaning, and child rearing tasks. They could write in letters to have them published, kind of like a Dear Abby column. And this club was really all about preparing girls to be able to run a home, care for children, and later kind of evolved into a public health program for young girls. So Florence joined the American Beauty Rose Circle of St. Croix Falls in 1903. She would have been 11 years old. And I bring this up because, intentionally or not, this club really reinforced gender roles and the societal norms of the time. It would have stressed the importance of being good at domestic labor. To be a girl was to concern yourself with matters of the home, raising children, and to really accept that role of caregiver. And so I think it's clubs like this, or activities like this, that probably helped to shape Florence's worldview. And it was a worldview that she both embraced and rebelled against, which you'll see tonight. Another really big part of Florence's childhood was the family cottage on Deer Lake. Her father established this cottage when he came to the St. Croix River Valley, and this family would spend summers there recreating, gardening, fishing, going on nature walks, which really solidified their reverence for the St. Croix River Valley. It was here that Florence was also allowed to really explore her love of photography and painting, though throughout her life she maintained that she wasn't an artist. So, along with photographs and video, I've been lucky enough to read some of Florence's letters that have survived throughout the years. And it kind of gives me a good sense of where her head was at when these things are happening throughout her life. And so this is from a letter to a friend around 1913. Florence is talking about when she's at the lake, she feels like she can be a kid again. She's able to wear her hair down, to wear comfortable clothes, and she was really able to act on that sense of adventure that was so important to her. So this quote here is just great. "I just had a fine swim. I rowed across the lake and most of the way back, and then when we were about 3/4 of the way back, I jumped in with all of my clothes on and swam ashore. It was the only way, as they won't let me swim unless we are bathing." And so another significant part of her love for this area is the fact that she lived so close to Interstate Park, which is something that we can all relate to. It was a huge part of her childhood and early life. She spent time with her friends, picnicking, hiking, canoeing there. And this really, again, just leads her to that love of ultimately what becomes a biology degree. And so once she graduates high school, she enrolls at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, to study biology further. And this is what leads her to probably the biggest adventure of her young life. So let me set a little bit of context here. I'll give you a history lesson of where Florence is going. The Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, Massachusetts was established by both men and women scientists in 1888. It was the first national marine biological institute of its kind in the United States. It wasn't affiliated with a school. It was run by scientists. So any school or scientist internationally could essentially come to study there when the lab was open. How it would work is you would pay like a subscription fee to rent time there. And what was really rare about this institution is that both men and women students were able to work together, research together, and hold equal positions of power. So one such person is this woman, Cornelia Clapp. She was one of the first 4 initial scientists to research at, I'm going to call it MBL, so I don't have to say Marine Biological Laboratory over and over. So she was a founder by all means, and she was a highly regarded professor of zoology at Mount Holyoke College. She was really instrumental in helping to establish the library at MBL, and she was known as the Institute's first librarian. So she would have been working at the institution when Florence travels there. And another important thing to note about Cornelia is that she was elected to the Board of Trustees in 1910, and she held that position her entire life. If you can make it out in the photo up on the screen, that's from 1933, and I think she kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. It's just like Cornelia and a bunch of suits on either side of her. So part of my research too, in looking at other women scientists of the time and women leaders at MBL, was really trying to understand what the attitude around studying the sciences would have been at this time. Yeah, I hear you chuckling because it's not a great quote. So I'll read it to you. Culture in young women should never develop into learning. A young woman cannot and ought not to plunge with the obstinate and persevering strength of a man into scientific pursuits as to become forgetful of everything else. And so what this quote goes on to say is that a woman does not have the same mental faculties as a man. So if she studies science, she's going to forget everything she's ever known about being a woman, and it's just over for her. And so I'm telling you that it is funny now, but it's just to set the context of kind of like what these women were up against and what they were kind of rebelling against at this time. So, as I hinted at earlier, Florence had the opportunity to travel to MBL to study and research over 2 summers. So she would travel from here by train to Massachusetts. The Marine Biological Laboratory is really near Martha's Vineyard, if you can kind of picture where that is. So a beautiful place to travel during the summer for sure. And really what she did is she became close with her biology professor at Carleton, who was conducting research there at the time to earn his doctorate, and he was sort of the bridge to be able to travel to MBL. So these are the credit cards, essentially, that Carleton has on file, showing that Florence received college credit for her time researching there. So this is Florence's professor, Neil S. Dungay, As I mentioned, he was working on earning his doctorate through the University of Chicago when he was at Woods Hole, or MBL. He taught at Carleton from 1907 to 1952, and his studies were really formative to public health initiatives at the time. So what you see here is essentially the table of contents for his thesis that he would have been working on with Florence at MBL. And his thesis work was really looking at the effects that alcohol had on the reproductive cycle of clamworms and sea urchins. And so when you go and you read this, you're sort of like, this is completely random. Why was he studying this? We have to kind of contextualize it, right? It's the early 20th century, and we really didn't know scientifically what the effects of alcohol were on the reproductive cycle or on an embryo. And so it makes sense. This was like the height of the temperance movement in the United States. So this research really would have been groundbreaking to some of the public health initiatives and legislation that come later after his time researching there. So as I mentioned earlier, Florence was a budding photographer. And when she was there in 1913, we are so lucky, she brought her camera with to MBL, so we can learn a little bit more about what it was like. I also have letters that she wrote from the Institute back home, and those letters also helped inform a lot of this part of the story. So here we see the eel pond at Woods Hole, Massachusetts, where Florence would have been doing things like collecting invertebrates, like sea urchins. And this was something that she would have had to have done by night. For whatever reason, the sea urchins like to come out by moonlight. And so if you can imagine a woman in like 19th century garb walking over the rocks with a little lantern trying to dig out sea urchins, it's just kind of a weird and beautiful image. And so that would have been one of her tasks there as a student or an investigator collecting specimens. And I wanted to share a few quotes from Florence herself tonight, just to give you a better idea of where her head was at this point in her life. So this is a quote from a letter to her future husband, Jake Riegel. And many times in his letters to her, from what I can gather, is he's really pushing to get engaged, to get married, to have a family together, that sort of thing. But Florence is just not there yet. And so I thought this was really a great kind of indicator of that, of what she really wanted from life, was a time to learn, to experience, and to really be independent and not beholden to anybody. So when she was at MBL, like I mentioned, one of her kind of big things that she would have been doing is, of course, conducting research, attending lectures, that sort of thing, more traditional learning. But a lot of the work was very hands-on, especially with specimen collection. So what you see here are the student investigators or researchers. I believe they're at the eel pond. I don't know what they are digging up, but again, it looks fairly rudimentary for what we might understand of marine biology today. Another way that they would collect specimens to study in the lab was to go on what they called excursions. And Florence took a couple of great photos here. What you see is the one of two excursion yachts that MBL had at the time. So this is a steamship called the Cayadetta, and it was actually built as a pleasure yacht for a rich New York merchant. He sold it to the school to help them out in 1906. The boat was 70 feet long, 13 beam, and 10 feet deep. And so they would take this boat all around, they would be out all day. One thing that students really liked about going out to the open sea for excursions is that the captain would prepare a barrel of clams and lobsters and he would run it through the steam on the ship. And then he would just feed the students the very fresh seafood. So it's something that was really notable about the experience of going out on the steamship. So this is an interior photo that Florence took of the first lab site where the scientists would essentially conduct their research. How it would work is schools would rent out a table or like a set of tables, and that would be kind of your work area. At the center of the room, I think you might be able to see it, there's a fairly rudimentary looking tank, like a wooden tank. And what this was sort of a preservation tank for your specimens. So it had fresh seawater pumped into it, and in the example of going out at night and collecting sea urchins, you'd bring them back to the lab, they'd live in the tank, and then you'd come back in the morning and you could start preparing your experiments for the day. So another angle, I'll say, of what was going on in Florence's life in 1912 and 1913, when she was out feeling independent, exploring the world, she also experienced really great tragedy. In 1912, Florence had to come home early from Carleton to take care of her father, her mother, and her younger brothers. Her father had suffered a stroke, and her mother was so distraught she was unable to take care of the house and the boys, and so Florence comes back to St. Croix Falls and she tries to complete her coursework through the mail, which I cannot even imagine at that time. Unfortunately, Florence's father passes away by May of 1912, and it's at that time that her brother Ray really kind of takes her under his wing, and he's encouraging her to transfer to Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. He really sees how bright she is, how dedicated she is to her studies, and he wants her to have better career opportunities. And so there's gentle pressure from him to drop out of Carleton and transfer and finish college in Massachusetts. However, her mother's physical and mental health continues to decline after the death of her father, and so Florence does not feel comfortable making any big decisions at that time. Her mother is in and out of a couple of sanitariums in a 10-month period, and ultimately she ends up passing away by suicide in early 1913. So Florence is in her early 20s and she loses both of her parents within a year's time. And so I have a little quote that kind of gives us an insight into how she may have been feeling. Her state of mind about her future was just not clear. She was very much murky in what she should do next. In 1913, she writes to her friends that she doesn't even really want to go back to Woods Hole because she's worried about taking care of her family and her younger brothers. And again, when she's asked about the possibility of marriage, Florence is like, please don't bother me with that right now, I'm going through a lot. And so she's just having a harder time finding her own path at this time. But what ends up happening is she does come back to Carleton. She finishes out her degree in biology there by the spring of 1914. She tries her hand at teaching high school after graduation, and she absolutely hates it. So I have letters from Sleepy Eye, Minnesota, and it sounds like I've never been there, but it just doesn't sound like a fun place to be stuck. And so she's writing to her friends, she's talking about how bored she is, and she's like, I don't want to just be a teacher, I want more from life. And it's after that that she decides to enroll at the University of Minnesota Nursing School, which was a program that was in its infancy at the time. It was started in 1909. So by 1915, she's in Minneapolis. It was also around the same time that Ray Stannard Baker writes a book it features a character. The heroine of the story is based on Florence. And it's a really, really sweet tribute to Florence if you read the book. It's called Hempfield. And the heroine in the novel is named Anthe. And she's named Anthe because when she was born, her mom really wanted her to be a boy, and she really wanted to be able to name him Anthony. And so, as a compromise, she named her little girl Anthe. And so this character, in the event of her father's death, she takes over as the editor of a local newspaper. And throughout the novel, she's described as capable as any man, and lovable and brave. And so I think this just really shows Ray's admiration for Florence, especially in her younger life. So like I mentioned, Florence moves to Minneapolis. She lives at 707 7th Street Southeast in Minneapolis with other nurses in a boarding house. She earns her nurse's cap and uniform in 1916, which means you're kind of out of that probationary period. And, I had to kind of talk with a nursing historian, which I did not know was a thing until a couple months ago. But in talking with this historian, she told me that women were not allowed to be in the nursing program and to be married. But I do know that in December of 1915, Florence and Jake Riegel get married. And so I'm not really sure, it's not lining up. I know that Florence does not finish the nursing program there. World War I breaks out. She has so much other stuff going on. But it wasn't until the 1960s that nursing students were even able to be married and be in the program. So what ends up happening is in 1917, her husband, Dr. Jake Riegel, he enters the service, he enters the Navy, and he serves on the USS Solace hospital ship. It's docked outside of New York City. And from there, that takes us back to St. Croix Falls, the Bodefish house. So, something that I didn't mention when we were talking about Florence's father passing away, I told you that Ray comes in and kind of takes her under his wing. But with that, her brother Harry becomes in charge of her and in charge of all of the assets of the family in St. Croix Falls, especially after her mother dies in 1913. And so after Mary dies, her mother, in 1913, Harry starts to sell things. He's selling the horses, he's selling the cows, he's getting rid of assets that belong to his father. And through letters, I can tell that this is really upsetting to Florence. She's kind of worried what's going to become of her family. She's seeing kind of her childhood and her old way of life losing its steam. And so I believe from what I've read that Florence likely could not bear to see her childhood home sold. And this was maybe part of her decision to get married somewhat impulsively. So as you know, women during this time couldn't just go out and own property. You couldn't just go buy a house on your own. It had to be willed to you, or it had to be owned by a man in your life. And so having her brothers in charge of any of her inheritance and kind of like her future financially, she wasn't going to be into that. And so that's where I think that sort of shift in mentality came of like, I don't want to get married, to, okay, sure, that sounds fine. I think that was kind of what happened here. And so what happens is they acquire Florence's childhood home, the Bodefish Baker house, and they start to build a family. So her first son, Stephen, was born in 1916, and then Gordon in 1917. She had 2 small children, 1 year apart. Her husband is off at World War I, and she owns this huge mansion by herself in St. Croix Falls. And so while she's away, she essentially kind of wakes the house back up, and she runs it as a boarding house for school teachers studying at the Polk County Normal School that was here at the time. And here are a few photos of the exterior of this house, which I feel we're so lucky to see because it's not standing today. This house was located where St. Croix Health Clinic is now. It was a massive, massive house. It had 22 rooms in total. And it wasn't until Jake returned from the war that he opened up private practice, and essentially they slowly turned their home into a hospital, whether intentional or not. And so what that meant for Florence is that she became the hospital's first, what we would know today as like an administrator. She is doing everything from cooking for the patients to laundry, hiring the nurses, hiring any kind of help that they need on site. She is running her home and a hospital at the same time. And I also think it's important to note here too, they did end up having 4 children that they raised in that house. So they were very much sharing their home with the community here, living upstairs while there's a hospital downstairs. And so it must have been a really interesting place to grow up for their children, Stephen, Gordon, Fred, who many of you maybe knew as Dr. Fred, and their daughter, Mary. It's really around this time that her entire life just becomes taking care of others. It becomes caregiving. And it wasn't until 1935 that they moved out of the hospital and finally made that separation of we're going to have our own house and we're not going to live in a hospital, which is just like constant action. All right, so that brings us to another important aspect of Florence's adult life. It's the river. It's this community. And I think we can't really talk about this community without talking about this building that we're in right now. So Florence was extremely connected to this building throughout her entire life. In letters, she writes to her sons and friends like what movies she saw here, which ones she didn't like, which ones she loved and she recommended. And so I have like a running list of movies that Florence liked. But more importantly, in 1918, as you know, there was the Spanish flu epidemic. And Florence was a part of the Red Cross at that time. And so she actually helped to take care of patients who were infected with the flu on the first floor of this building. So that room, if you were in the lounge area earlier, that would have been set up as a hospital. Over the years, she was the chairperson of the local Red Cross chapter, which meant many fundraisers throughout her life. In one note, she mentions coming here to make fried chicken for 300 people for a fundraiser. And I don't know if you've ever been in the what was the kitchen area. It's so tiny, I can't even imagine taking on something like that. So if you didn't stop in the main level on your way in, definitely go check it out on your way out. Additionally, in 1921, she was elected the president of the St. Croix Falls Women's Club. You see a couple of artifacts from that up on the screen right now. But an important aspect of that is she was part of the group of women who started a traveling library in town. So they would raise money to buy books, and this library would essentially travel around to little businesses so people had an opportunity to experience a book. And this later evolved into our public library system. So it's pretty incredible to learn where it started off, just like a crate of books, and now we have that awesome building. In terms of more of Florence's work that she was up to, she was elected to serve on Wisconsin's Public Health Commission in the 1950s as a representative of northwestern Wisconsin. And her keystone initiative, I thought this was really interesting, was mental health care and mental health awareness, which would have been really kind of groundbreaking and strange for the 1950s. It wasn't until recently that we could even talk about such a thing. And I bring this up to say that I think it likely has something to do with how she lost her mother so young in life, and watching how sick her mother was. And so she was an early mental health advocate in the area, which is great. And I did not have a picture to illustrate that, so here's a picture of her knitting. That is awesome. I think it says on the back, she like wrote a little note on the back of this, and it says something like, I just finished my 23rd sweater, which is crazy. And I think they were all to go to children in need, which is even like, wow. Expert knitter, for sure. Outside of all of the stuff she did, all of the work she did, she and her husband Jake really bonded over their love of the river, outdoor recreation, and they went on many fishing and canoeing adventures on the St. Croix and Namaquagan. They were part of an unofficial group known as the River Rats, which you see here, who went on many adventures on the St. Croix. So Florence's husband Jake was approached to serve on Wisconsin's first ever conservation commission in the 1930s, led by Aldo Leopold. Here I have a picture of Jake. This is also from the Star Tribune. He is pledging a National Pledge of Conservation in 1948. And I'm showing this really to say, by all accounts, Florence was the motivation and the driving force behind Jake's action in this area. The Riegels later in his time on the Conservation Commission really pushed for the state of Wisconsin to acquire the Croix Meadows area and to have that be a preserved, conserved site for all of us to go and enjoy, especially the cranes. And so that takes us to the park, and it's not the park you're thinking about. So this entire presentation, if you remember, started off in a waiting room, and now we're going to another St. Croix Falls hotspot. Oops. This is a picture of the sign outside of Florence Baker Riegel Park. And so in the early 1970s, Fred Riegel, Florence's son, donated approximately 100 acres of land to the Nature Conservancy in memory of his mother and to preserve it from development. He donated it with the intention that it would be used to educate the community about our local ecosystem here. When he did this, he also made the stipulation that the park should be known as Florence Baker Riegel Park and not just Riegel Park, considering that her name was frequently overshadowed by her husband's. And so today, the land is now owned by the city of St. Croix Falls. It is a park. I'm sure many of you have been there. The natural environment of the park is comprised of basalt outcroppings, prairie, pines, a stream, and some natural springs. However, over time, there have been a lot of additions, as you know, to the park. It continues to grow. And so with that, I want to bring it back to Florence a little bit. I really hope that you see why I find this story so inspiring. And I hope you also see how invested Florence was in making this a safe community, a healthy place for us all to live. I encourage you to think about her when you are out and about, maybe spending time on the river, checking out the park. And for me anyway, I hope to continue this kind of journey that I'm on, learning about Florence's weird, life. It definitely does not say heart on the screen. And I really want to write a book about Florence, which is something I have never done before, but I'm working on it. And so to close out this evening, please bear with me. I'm going to read you an excerpt of a short story that I wrote during the Pine Needles residency. All right, this is called Not to Worry, Dear Florence. I keep watch with the others from the bluff across the river. It's not a job, but a post I took to instinctively, as my father before me and his before that. We don't often see strangers here due to the extreme remoteness of this particular stretch of river. 100 years ago, men hunting beaver pelts thought we were angels. Our great blue wings and long-pointed beaks made them think our presence was biblical, as if we presented a blessing or were harbingers of danger and death. When in truth, we pose no threat, but we promise no blessing. Anyone traveling the current is of no consequence to us. Most nights, we dance high above the river in the rookery, our nests padded with purple Indian grass and the tops of arrowhead lily pads. Our babies are clumsy and nestled high in the air. We cry and call to one another in celebration of another day completed in peace. We've been dancing before God and even before history. We hatch our young high in the white pines and feed them fish from the riverbed. We do not sing like angels, but this is not hell. Most people find this section of the river only in a dream, or they're paddling upwards, mistakenly thinking that they're on their way to some promised land or the sea. However, today is different. From my post, I see a girl or a woman, I can't be too sure, and she's drifting downriver in a small canoe. We see her now, her eyes closed, and yet she's beginning to paddle. There's an old man with a wild silver mustache folded into the front of her canoe. He's holding a bouquet of funerary herbs, rosemary and oregano. Her eyes open, and the girl is aghast, trying to paddle toward the shore. But a slight swirl of the deep current fights against the weight of the canoe, so I fly in a bit closer. Father, what are we doing here? This boat isn't big enough for the both of us. The old man sits up straight and confused from his slumber. Grasping the sides of the canoe and bleary-eyed, he surveys his surroundings. He hurriedly and instinctively brings a silver ear horn to his right ear and leans forward to better hear her concern. Father, we'll capsize, we'll fall in. Not to worry, dear, not to worry, he says, shaking his head calmly. I am dead now and practically weightless. We buried you in the family plot. How did you get here? Yes, I can see why this was confusing. But this is not me. My body is not here. It's certainly and unfortunately dead. What you see now is my mortal soul, and I would be much obliged if you would give me a ride. Florence stared into his eyes, still so kind and familiar, and steadied the canoe with her paddle. Am I dreaming? In a way, yes, I think. Major gestured to the air above his head with his ear horn. The two sat stunned for a moment. The smell of the herbal bouquet in his lap was strong, leaving a trail behind them as they progressed slowly down the river. The smell reminded Florence of girlhood spells her and her sister Winifred would cast to ensure they'd find good husbands. They'd been taught the ritual by their spinster aunt Amanda, who their father had reluctantly banished to a little white cottage just down the street from the family home. Florence's pious mother disapproved of Amanda's influence on her daughters, but some of the lessons stuck and they resonated with the children. So sometimes at night, the small girls would sneak out into the garden and snip bits of herbs with their embroidery shears. They would place a sprig of thyme and of rosemary in each of their slippers, and then a sprig on either side of the bed, and chant in unison 3 times before falling asleep. Agnes sweet and Agnes fair, hither, hither now repair. Bonny Agnes, let me see the lad who will come to marry me. In their dreams, they'd hoped to see the faces of young men courting them through moonlit gardens. But all Florence ever dreamed of was Lord Tennyson and the volumes of poetry she would sneak from Major's library. Most nights she lay awake, finding comfort in imagining the shadows in the hall lamplight, or ghosts playing tricks on one another while her entire family slept. I hate the dreadful hollow behind the little wood. Its lips in the field above are dabbled with blood-red heath. The red-ribbed ledges drip with a silent horror of blood, and echo there, wherever is asked here answers death. Major recited the poem with a little bit of a smile. You remember, you always loved that poem. Florence stared at him and did not reply. She sat quietly for a moment, examining the shoreline and listening to the calls of nighthawks overhead. The sandstone cliffs hovered high above the river, carved with the names and dates of others passers-by. The formations watched the pair like gargoyles as they progressed along the still riverway to an unknown destination. Today there is no sun, only the reflection of sun, and a dark gray haze has settled above them. Why me, Father? Why did you come to me? Look at you, my dear, almost a college graduate and still looking as fat and happy as a baby, Major exclaimed, ignoring her questions. And then studying the gray clouds, he began to monologue, as he frequently did. Did you know you were supposed to be my 7th son? On the day you were born, your mama cried and cried, some tears happy, but some of disappointment. You see, you were supposed to be named after me, another baker to take my name to a new generation. And after all that effort and all that pain, your mama, who was so little and meek, was so tired and so shamefully disappointed that you weren't what she expected. She thought of naming you Josephine. But then I thought that wouldn't be right. I have 8 sons, you know. I told her we'd have more, and we did. We did. How remarkable is life. Your little brother Joseph came just 2 years after you, and what a glorious day it was. Your mama could finally name my junior. But of course, we could not call him that. We called him Stannard to avoid any confusion in this life and the next. My 7th son, we worried you would be so jealous, but you were just such a good girl, and you were always such an easy child in an imaginary world, always watching and observing the boys, and oh, the adventures we had. You were just as strong as the rest of them, never fearful of the water or the dark, unlike any girl I'd ever seen. Like a cow reciting Byron, I'd say, "Ha, look, Mary, that's my girl," and we would laugh from the shore as you learned to dive, set your own traps for squirrels, fish for sunfish from our dock. Do you remember? Well, of course you do. But there comes a time in every little girl's life when she has to grow up and no longer be coarse and dowdy like a boy. And so your mama was so sick, and you were always the willing little helper. Some days you'd ride old Dan to the office, carrying the correspondence I'd accidentally left home. And your mama had so much to teach you, the sewing, the piano, the painting, enough to keep you occupied for a lifetime. In fact, I'm surprised to see you're not darning a sock right now. He let out a full laugh that echoed against the bluffs. Your brothers had their academic pursuits, and I am proud to say I had some part of their successes. Normally, Florence loved to listen to her father's long and winding tales, but she was growing impatient with his evasiveness. Please, why am I here with you now? Where are we going? He started again. Oh yes, that's right. Well, I'm sad to say I never got to write all of this down. My one regret is never finishing my manuscript. I've lived a life, you know. I worked so hard to tell my stories there, but in the end, well, I could hardly hold a pen except to write bits and bobs to your brothers, hoping it would garner enough interest for them to continue my legacy. But you see, dear Florence, I needed a favor. You are the reliable child, and your mother battles a melancholy that my appearing to her in a dream, in a boat, would surely drive her to ruin. So, you are strong, and you obey, and you're quick to paddle a canoe. And I knew you would not tarry to assist me in this unconventional situation, somewhat otherworldly, no doubt, which I might add is somewhat embarrassing for your old dad, who did not go straight to heaven, which I'm still struggling to understand, as I have lived a good and virtuous life. But God in all his infinite wisdom, it seems, has me in a time out. Yes, a purgatory by the river, and before I bothered anyone else, I thought I would call upon you. We come from a long line of heroes. Well, I know you know that. My great-grandfather, Remember Baker, of the Green Mountain Boys, died fighting the redcoats in the early days. And my father, who was a peaceful man, preferred the company of trees over people. And he lived to tell that tale. How remarkable to be in such a long line of heroic men. Florence stopped paddling for a moment and just let them drift. For the first time she realized there was no weight in the front of the boat where her father sat. She considered her mother, who was likely asleep at the family home, dreamless, in a big bed all alone for the first time in many years. And then she imagined herself in her twin bed in her childhood bedroom, lying with her backside to the wall. This entire situation unfolding only in her mind. I don't think I've ever read or talked so long in my life. So I just want to quickly, these are all of the people and institutions that have supported me over the past few months, helping me with everything from research to helping me secure this building for tonight to be able to share with you all. It's been really incredible to experience all of the people who are willing to show up with the same enthusiasm that I have about Florence's story, and enthusiasm for something I'm working on. So I hope to continue learning about Florence, and I hope you follow along as I post things on Northern Exposure Online. Yeah, thank you for everything.